The town of Waverly Falls had always been a peaceful place, nestled deep in the countryside where everyone knew each other's names. It was the kind of town where rumors and gossip spread like wildfire, yet no one could ever imagine anything truly sinister lurking beneath the surface. But on the night of the Halloween carnival, everything changed. The air was thick with the scent of autumn leaves and candy apples as families gathered in the town square. The festivities were in full swing, games, rides, and a towering haunted house that had drawn everyone in. Children ran in costume, their laughter ringing out across the square as the orange glow of jack-o'-lanterns illuminated the streets. Among the revelers, a group of friends, Sarah, Jake, Emily, and Ryan, strolled down the cobblestone path, their eyes scanning the assortment of booths and attractions. They'd been planning this night for weeks, each of them eagerly awaiting the spookiest night of the year. But something felt off. Maybe it was the way the wind had picked up, or the fact that the carnival seemed a little emptier than usual. Or maybe it was the feeling that something was watching them. "Did you guys hear that?" Jake asked, his voice low, as they neared the edge of the carnival grounds. The group paused, looking around. The sound was faint but unmistakable, a chainsaw, its engine revving and sputtering in the distance. "That's weird," Emily said, frowning. "There wasn't any chainsaw attraction scheduled for tonight." "I don't know," Ryan began, his eyes narrowing. "Maybe it's just part of the haunted house. You know, like a special effect." Sarah, always the more adventurous of the group, grinned. "Let's go check it out. It'll be fun." Without waiting for an answer, she darted toward the sound, with Jake reluctantly following behind. Emily and Ryan exchanged wary glances, but they couldn't very well let their friends go off alone, so they trailed after them, their footsteps crunching on the leaves that littered the ground. The chainsaw grew louder as they approached the outskirts of the carnival, just beyond the last row of booths. It wasn't coming from the haunted house, no, this was something else entirely. The sound seemed to echo through the darkened trees, making the hairs on the back of Sarah's neck stand on end. Suddenly, a figure appeared at the edge of the trees. It was tall, dressed in tattered clothes, with a wide grin painted across its face. At first, they thought it was part of the carnival, perhaps some kind of twisted performer. But then, they saw the chainsaw. It was massive, gleaming under the flickering light of a nearby street lamp. The figure revved the chainsaw again, the noise deafening. The clown stepped forward, its eyes locked onto the group with a feral intensity. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she realized this wasn't a performer, it was something far worse. "Run!" Jake shouted, grabbing Emily's arm and pulling her back. But before they could turn, the clown let out a guttural laugh, the chainsaw roaring to life again as it lunged toward them. They didn't have time to think. Panic surged through them as they bolted into the woods, branches slapping against their faces and the ground beneath their feet shifting with every hurried step. Behind them, they could hear the chainsaw, its roar growing louder as the clown pursued. "What the hell is that thing?" Ryan gasped, his voice panicked as he ran alongside Sarah. "It's not part of the carnival." "Of course it's not," Sarah shouted back. "Just keep running." The woods seemed endless, the trees towering above them like dark sentinels, their twisted branches blocking out most of the moonlight. Every time they looked over their shoulders, the clown was closer, its eyes glowing with a terrifying hunger. "Where do we go?" Emily cried, her voice trembling with fear. "We're trapped." "We just need to find somewhere to hide," Jake said, his voice sharp with panic. "We can't outrun him forever." They pushed on, their breath ragged, their legs burning with the effort to keep going. But then, ahead of them, a figure emerged from the shadows, another person, standing motionless in the dark. "Help!" Ryan yelled, but the figure didn't respond. It just stood there, its face obscured by a mask. The figure didn't seem like it was trying to help, they seemed to be watching, waiting for something. As they got closer, the chainsaw's roar reached a deafening crescendo, and in that instant, the figure stepped aside, revealing the path they had been desperately searching for. It was narrow, barely visible in the dark. "This way!" Sarah shouted, urging the group to follow. They sprinted down the narrow path, the sound of chainsaw footsteps echoing behind them. The clown was close, its laugh rising above the roar of the engine, sending shivers down their spines. But as they pushed forward, the path suddenly twisted, and the trees seemed to close in around them. The figure from earlier reappeared, now standing at the end of the path, blocking their way. "Please, help us!" Emily cried, her voice cracking with desperation. "We're being chased by a clown with a chainsaw." The figure remained silent, unmoving, as if waiting for something. Then, without warning, they raised their hand and pointed toward a small clearing just beyond the trees. "Go," the figure whispered in a low, eerie voice. "Hurry." Without questioning the strange figure, Sarah urged the others forward. The clearing was just ahead, and it felt like their only hope. But as they reached it, they realized the figure had not led them to safety. No, it had led them straight into the heart of the madness. The clearing was filled with other figures, all wearing similar masks, all standing motionless, watching them with cold, unblinking eyes. They were surrounded. The chainsaw roared again, and the clown appeared at the edge of the clearing, its grin wide and predatory. It revved the chainsaw, the noise deafening, as it took slow, deliberate steps toward the group. "No!" Ryan screamed, backing away, his eyes wide with terror. "No, no, no." But it was too late. The clown lunged forward, its chainsaw raised high, and the others closed in from all sides, their eyes never leaving the group. There was no escape. No hope. And in that moment, Sarah realized, this wasn't a carnival. This wasn't a prank. This was a nightmare. A nightmare from which there would be no waking. The last thing Sarah heard before the chainsaw's roar drowned out everything else was the haunting laugh of the clown, echoing through the woods, promising that no one would ever leave Waverly Falls again. The moon hung high in the sky, casting an eerie light over the clearing as Sarah, Jake, Emily, and Ryan stood frozen in fear. The clown, its chainsaw still roaring, took another step forward, its eyes gleaming with madness. But the figures surrounding them, all wearing the same eerie masks, did not move. They simply watched, as if this had all been rehearsed. Like they were waiting for something. A chill ran down Sarah's spine. The air felt heavier now, as if the woods themselves were holding their breath. The clown took another step, its grin widening, its laughter echoing across the clearing. It was like a symphony of madness, a twisted melody that made Sarah's stomach twist with dread. "Run!" Jake suddenly shouted, breaking the silence. Without a second thought, he turned and sprinted toward the far side of the clearing, his footsteps pounding against the earth. But as he reached the edge of the trees, something strange happened. The path he had just seen, was gone. "Jake, what are you doing?" Emily cried, grabbing his arm. But there was no answer. The only sound was the constant roar of the chainsaw and the rhythmic, almost hypnotic, laughter of the clown. Ryan, too, began to panic, turning back to the masked figures. "Who are you people? What do you want from us?" His voice trembled, a mix of anger and terror. The masked figures did not answer. They just stared, silent and unblinking. As if their presence alone was all that was needed to keep them trapped here, in this endless nightmare. The clown, sensing the group's desperation, began to advance with deliberate steps. Each movement was slow, purposeful, like a predator savoring the moment before it struck. The closer it got, the more Sarah felt her heart pound in her chest. The air grew thicker, the scent of gasoline overpowering as the chainsaw's engine revved louder, filling the space between her ears. There was no escape. But then, a sound broke through the tension, a low, guttural growl. It wasn't from the clown, but from somewhere deeper in the woods. The sound was primal, like the growl of an animal, something that didn't belong in this world. For a split second, the clown hesitated, its chainsaw slowing as it turned its head toward the woods. The group seized the opportunity. Without thinking, Sarah grabbed Emily's hand, pulling her toward the far side of the clearing. Ryan followed behind, his face pale with fear, but determination flashing in his eyes. The clown was distracted, its attention diverted by whatever creature lurked in the woods. "Now's our chance!" Sarah shouted, her voice trembling. They pushed past the trees, running as fast as their legs could carry them. The sound of the chainsaw roared once more, but the clown didn't immediately follow. It seemed to be facing whatever dark presence had just emerged from the forest. As they ran, the woods became denser, the trees pressing in on all sides. The ground beneath them was uneven, but they dared not stop, knowing that the moment they did, the chainsaw would find them again. Suddenly, Emily screamed. The ground beneath her foot gave way, and she tumbled forward, her body hitting the dirt with a sickening thud. Sarah stopped, her heart in her throat. "Emily," she cried, turning back to help her friend. But when she reached out to grab Emily's arm, a loud, guttural laugh echoed from behind her, chilling her to the core. It wasn't the clown this time, it was something darker. Something far more sinister. Turning, Sarah's eyes widened in horror. Emerging from the shadows was a creature, tall, with elongated limbs and eyes glowing a haunting shade of yellow. It had no face, just a smooth, pale surface where its features should have been. The sound that it made was more than a laugh, it was an otherworldly screech, like something from a nightmare made real. "Sarah, go!" Emily shouted from the ground, her voice strained with pain as she tried to push herself up. "Run! Don't stop!" But it was too late. The creature reached out with one of its long, clawed hands, grabbing Emily by the ankle. She screamed in terror, struggling against the grip, but the creature's strength was unimaginable. It dragged her backward, pulling her further into the shadows, its screech growing louder. "Emily!" Sarah screamed, but she couldn't move. Her legs felt frozen, her mind paralyzed with fear. She could hear the chainsaw again, its roar growing nearer, but it was drowned out by the creature's otherworldly scream. Jake and Ryan appeared behind her, and without a second thought, they ran toward the sound of Emily's cries, determined to save their friend. But as they reached the spot where Emily had fallen, the creature vanished back into the darkness, taking Emily with it. A silence fell over the group, broken only by the heavy, ragged breathing of Sarah, Jake, and Ryan. "What the hell was that thing?" Jake gasped, his face pale. "I don't know," Sarah whispered, her voice shaky. "But we have to go. We have to find her." But as they turned to leave, a movement at the edge of the trees caught their attention. The clown was there again, its chainsaw gleaming in the moonlight, its grin even wider than before. "No!" Sarah screamed, her mind reeling as she pushed past her friends and ran toward the opposite direction. The clown wasn't chasing them, it was waiting. Watching. The woods seemed to close in around them, the trees growing taller, the path narrowing as they ventured deeper into the forest. Every step they took seemed to bring them closer to something terrible. The sound of the chainsaw was now muffled, replaced by the strange sound of whispers in the wind. Then, another laugh, this one more twisted, more cruel, echoed in the distance. "Sarah," a voice whispered from the shadows. Sarah froze, her heart leaping into her throat. The voice was familiar. Too familiar. "Emily," she called, her voice trembling. But no answer came. The clown's laugh cut through the silence again, louder this time, closer. Sarah's mind raced. There was no way out. But then, as if summoned by the fear itself, the figure of the creature appeared again, emerging from the shadows, its hollow eyes fixed on Sarah. Its screeching laugh reverberated through the trees, drowning out the roar of the chainsaw. It wasn't after them. It was after something else. The clown stood still, its chainsaw lowered to the ground, as the creature and the masked figures from the carnival surrounded it. In that moment, the night felt alive with malevolent energy, like they were in the middle of a ritual, a dark ceremony of death and despair. The figures raised their hands toward the sky, as if in worship of the creature that now stood between them and their victims. "Run!" Ryan shouted again, pulling Sarah by the arm. They didn't know where to go. They didn't know what they were running from, but they had no choice. As they sprinted through the woods, the sounds of chainsaws and otherworldly laughter followed them, but something else was changing. The woods were shifting, the path no longer linear, as if the very earth itself was warping around them. Sarah's breath came in ragged gasps as she pushed herself harder. They had to escape, but it seemed like the woods were alive with terror, shifting and changing to keep them trapped. They ran until their legs couldn't carry them anymore. The night seemed endless, and the sounds of chainsaws and laughter followed them everywhere. There was no escaping the nightmare. In the end, they realized there was no way out. No salvation. No safety. The carnival had always been more than it seemed. The dark heart of Waverly Falls had opened its eyes, and they had come too close to see its horrors. The last thing Sarah saw before the darkness closed in around them was the smile of the clown, its chainsaw revving once more. And then, everything went silent. The darkness stretched on, consuming everything in its path. Sarah, Jake, and Ryan were trapped in an endless loop of terror. The woods no longer seemed real, there was no solid ground beneath their feet, only an unsettling sense of floating, like the world was spinning in slow motion. They ran and ran, but it was as if the forest itself had become a maze, shifting with every step they took. The trees twisted into impossible shapes, their limbs reaching out like skeletal hands, their leaves whispering faintly in the wind. The air had a sickly sweetness to it, the smell of decay mixed with something sharp and metallic. It made Sarah's stomach churn. And yet, despite all of this, they kept running. Behind them, the chainsaw roared back to life, its deafening screech sending waves of panic through Sarah's body. She could feel the presence of the clown, closer now than ever, its malevolent laugh echoing through the darkness. She could sense its hunger, the unholy desire to find them, to tear them apart, and that was enough to push her forward. Jake's breathing was ragged, his voice strained as he shouted, "Sarah, we need to stop. We need a plan. We don't have time." Sarah yelled, glancing back. The clown was gaining on them. Its figure was distorted in the dim light, a grotesque parody of something human, its smile wide and unhinged. The chainsaw was raised high, glinting with the faint light of the moon as it revved again, ready to tear through whatever it touched. The trees parted slightly ahead of them, revealing what seemed like an open field. The change in scenery was jarring, a sharp contrast to the twisted maze they had been running through. It was an eerie sort of calm, the kind that comes just before the storm. Ryan, the last of the group, turned to Sarah with wide eyes. "What if we don't make it out? What if there's no escape from this?" Sarah stopped, her heart pounding. She wanted to say something reassuring, something that would make the fear in Ryan's eyes go away, but the truth was, she didn't know if there was a way out. She had no answers. All she had was the instinct to keep running. "We'll make it," she lied, forcing a grin that didn't reach her eyes. "We'll find a way." But the truth was becoming painfully clear, there was no escape. The clearing was larger now, the edges barely visible through the dark mist that seemed to hover at its border. The moonlight cast strange, elongated shadows across the field, making it look like a scene from a twisted dream. And then, just as Sarah took a step forward, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. At the center of the field stood a towering figure, massive, hulking, with its back turned to them. It was the creature, the one that had taken Emily. It stood completely still, its limbs unnaturally long, stretched out like a spider's. But it was not the creature that terrified Sarah, it was the presence behind it. The masked figures, standing in a perfect circle around the creature, watching with their cold, dead eyes. They had been waiting for her, waiting for all of them. Suddenly, the laughter stopped. The roar of the chainsaw fell silent. The woods held their breath. A voice, cold and ancient, filled the air. It was not the clown's voice, nor the creature's, but something else entirely, a presence that seemed to come from deep within the earth. "You should not have come," the voice whispered, its words slithering into Sarah's mind like poison. "This is not your place." Ryan, who had been silently watching, suddenly snapped. "What do you want from us?" he shouted. "Why are you doing this?" The masked figures moved in unison, slowly tilting their heads toward him. Their movements were mechanical, deliberate, like a puppeteer pulling invisible strings. And then, without warning, one of them stepped forward, its hand reaching out to touch Ryan's shoulder. Ryan froze, his eyes wide with terror. He tried to pull away, but the figure's grip was like iron. In that moment, he knew it was too late. The darkness that had surrounded them for so long was no longer just in the woods, it was inside of them now. "You're not leaving," the voice crooned. "None of you are." Jake reached for Ryan, but the moment his hand touched his friend's arm, something twisted in the air. The woods themselves seemed to bend, the ground shaking violently as the sky darkened to an unnatural black. The ground split open with a deafening crack. It wasn't an earthquake, it was something worse, something primal. Sarah felt her heart stop as the earth swallowed them whole, pulling them down into an abyss. They fell. Time seemed to lose all meaning as they descended. The sound of chainsaws, laughter, and screams became a blur, fading into the distance. But there was something else in the darkness, something ancient and waiting. The further they fell, the colder it became, until the freezing grip of the abyss wrapped around them like icy fingers. When they finally landed, it was not on solid ground but in a pit, a deep, suffocating pit filled with the echoes of the past. The walls around them were slick with moisture, covered in shadows that moved of their own accord. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of decay, and yet, there was no sound. No chainsaw, no laughter, no voices. Just an eerie silence. They looked around, disoriented. Sarah's heart raced. She didn't know where they were. This wasn't just the forest. This place felt otherworldly. As if they had crossed some threshold into another realm, a realm where time and space no longer made sense. The creature appeared again, stepping from the shadows. Its long, spindly fingers reached out, but it didn't move toward them. Instead, it simply stood there, staring at them with its hollow, faceless gaze. It was as if it was waiting for them to understand something, something they could never comprehend. And then, the clown appeared. It emerged from the shadows, dragging the chainsaw behind it, its grin even wider now, as if it knew something they didn't. "You've crossed into the place between worlds," the voice said again, its tone dripping with malevolence. "And now, there is no going back." The realization hit Sarah like a punch to the gut. They weren't just lost in the woods anymore. They weren't even in the same reality. They had entered something far darker, something that fed on fear and despair. A place where souls were trapped forever. And then, with a sickening screech, the ground beneath them began to open again. It wasn't an escape this time. It was the final descent. The last thing Sarah saw before everything plunged into darkness was the clown's face, its twisted grin still there, mocking her. And she understood it all too late. They were never meant to escape. They were never meant to leave. They were just another part of the carnival. And the carnival was eternal. The darkness grew thicker, suffocating, as the ground cracked open beneath them. A cold, clammy mist swirled around Sarah, Jake, and Ryan, pulling them deeper into the abyss. They didn't even have the strength to scream anymore. Whatever had happened to them, whatever they had crossed into, drained every last ounce of energy, leaving them hollow, like marionettes with no strings. The clown's chainsaw revved once again, its roar now almost deafening, but there was something different about it. It no longer sounded like a machine, it sounded alive. Hungry. As the mist thickened, the walls of the pit seemed to grow closer, closing in on them. Sarah tried to move, but her body felt too heavy, too tired. The earth beneath her feet felt wrong, like the very ground was alive, shifting, pulling at her legs. In the distance, the creature stirred again, its long fingers moving across the walls of the pit like they were searching for something. Sarah's heart raced. She had no idea what it wanted, but she knew, deep down, that it wasn't finished with them yet. Suddenly, the air shifted. It was as if everything stopped, no chainsaw, no laughter, no movement. Just a profound silence that hung in the air like a thick fog. Sarah couldn't move, couldn't breathe. She was trapped in a nightmare that had no end. And then, in that oppressive silence, a whisper. A voice, low and guttural, like it had been waiting in the shadows for the right moment to speak. "You should have listened," it murmured, the sound like an echo from the deepest parts of the earth. Sarah's eyes snapped open, her pulse racing. She could feel the weight of the words, as if the voice had taken root in her mind, growing like a weed. She could hear it clearly now, speaking directly to her. "We've been waiting for you." And then it happened. The ground beneath her feet cracked open with a force that sent her tumbling into the darkness. She fell, not into the void she had feared, but into something far worse. A carnival. A carnival that was not like any Sarah had ever seen before. There were no lights. No sounds of laughter or joy. Only endless rows of tents, their fabric torn and tattered, hanging like the remnants of a long-forgotten nightmare. The air was thick with the smell of rot and decay, the sweet-sour scent of something dying. But worst of all, there were people. People who shouldn't have been there. People who were like shadows, their bodies contorted in unnatural ways, their eyes vacant, staring into nothing. They were prisoners here, just like Sarah, Jake, and Ryan. The carnival had claimed them all. Sarah tried to scream, but no sound came. She looked around, her heart sinking. They were stuck in this world, this place between the living and the dead, where there was no escape, no hope. The clown appeared again, its face twisted into that same grotesque grin. It didn't need to speak. Its presence alone was enough to convey everything it wanted them to understand. "You're mine now," it whispered. Its voice was soft, almost sweet, like a lullaby. But there was nothing sweet about it. The chainsaw hummed, its roar fading into the background like a distant memory. And the masked figures, the ones who had watched them, who had surrounded them, began to move. They didn't walk. They slithered, their bodies contorting in impossible ways, dragging themselves toward Sarah. Jake and Ryan were by her side now, but there was nothing they could do. The carnival had already claimed them. They were no longer people, no longer alive. They were just part of the show. A part of the nightmare. And as the mist closed in, Sarah understood. This was where they would stay. Forever. In the end, there was no escape. The carnival had always been waiting, always been a part of the world. A place where nightmares lived, and where they were destined to die. As the mist swallowed them whole, Sarah's final thought was one of regret. Not for herself, but for the world that would never know the truth. That the carnival was real. And it would never let them go.